So the first 5 or 6 slides are just by way of introduction. And slide 2, we sort of worked on the assumption that a number of you would have heard talk, possibly even from Frank and myself, around this topic before, and that we shouldn't spend a long time rehearsing the existing material. And the draft guideline itself, for those of you who've read it, you'll be aware that it tries to present a framework, and indeed a framework that can be broadly applied for different types of trial design, perhaps different stages of drug development, and certainly across different types of medicinal product and therapeutic area. It is hence necessarily, I would say, somewhat abstract and rather broad. And rather than, again, rehearse the contents and the different aspects of that framework, we'll go fairly quickly through the ICH document itself, and as I say, spend time trying to illustrate some of the thinking and the possibilities using the 3 examples. But okay, let's start with a motivation and ask ourselves the question of why Estimands. Perhaps the answer to that depends on who you are and where you fit, and in particular if you're the patient, the prescriber, the payer, the drug developer, or the regulator. But I wrote down some of the factors which have influenced the group and certainly influenced myself going into this conversation. The first being the need to be able to explain which treatment effect we're describing to prescribers and other stakeholders in the materials that the regulators produce. And I emphasize the word which because I think a really important part of this conversation, a light bulb moment, is realizing that all the various choices we make about data collection and analysis aren't equal different ways of doing the same thing. They correspond to different attributes of a treatment that we might measure, so that there are multiple treatment effects that we might try to quantify. And once we realize that, you see the importance of being clear on which one is actually the focus. And there has been, I think, or I would contend, some misalignment between trial objectives and trial design and analysis at a sort of a macro level, at a high level, with trial objectives being stated rather vaguely, and at a more precise level of trial protocols and sponsor documentation indicating that the ITT approach is being followed, but the design and analysis that doesn't seem to support that. And some of those conversations were difficult. There wasn't necessarily a language and a framework to have conversations about problems that seem to exist in practice. And I think this framework gives us the opportunity to have better conversations, not just between statisticians, but with colleagues from other disciplines as well, to talk about which treatment effects we really want to quantify and whether we have the methods and the trial designs available that can do that for us. In particular, separating out what we are trying to estimate from how we are going to estimate it. And finally, who knows where this conversation might lead in the end. I think there are some short-term wins in addressing some aspects of current practice and improving communication. But maybe there'll be some more fundamental changes about the treatment effects that we actually try and quantify as drug developers and regulators. So next slide, please. That's slide number 3. And there's a lovely picture in the corner of the ICH expert working group, and in addition to Frank and myself, the two other EU representatives, Chrissy from EFPIA and Frank Patavi from EMA, are smiling happily in the photograph, and I think there's one or two other colleagues from the group who are on the line as well. We completed our work on the draft addendum to E9 at our last face-to-face meeting, and that now gets released in the different regulatory regions for a consultation period. That's happened in the EU, it's happened in other regulatory regions. I think some are still in the final stages. I think I saw that the internal FDA process for consultation in the US will complete in the next week or two. And to accompany the draft addendum, we are in the process of producing some training materials which should both help to increase understanding of the guideline text, to shine some further light into the text, and I hope can provide a useful resource as colleagues like yourselves who are more engaged in the topic are then able to take this conversation and this framework into your respective development teams and into your respective companies somewhat as champions of what we're trying to achieve. On the next slide, please, slide 4, there is an overview of the framework that Chrissy mentioned and that the document introduces, placing the Estimand as a sort of more precise description of the objective that you're trying to address in the trial, quantifying the scientific question that you're posing or the treatment effect that you want to estimate, which can then inform aspects of trial design and statistical analysis. And you get this flow between or from the Estimand down to the estimator, and finally the estimate. Now, there's not so much in the document said about the estimator or the analytical approach. Once you start writing down guidance around choice of analytical approach, it might be difficult to stop, and the document would have become remarkably long. The document instead talks about the Estimand part and about sensitivity analyses. Going back to what I said at the start, we have lived in a world and worked in a world where, to some extent, we've thought that multiple different ways of analysis should all give us the same answer. In some ways, that whichever way you do your statistical methodology, you're trying to estimate the same thing. Having realized that that's not the case, the way in which we do sensitivity analyses, and even the analyses we call sensitivity analyses in current practice, doesn't really make sense. Why should fundamentally different statistical approaches give you the same answer? It may tell you that the amount of intercurrent events or the amount of missing data is not large in respect of the size of the treatment effect, but in principle, no reason to expect the same answer from these fundamentally different approaches. And that calls also then to redefine what we mean, or make more precise what we mean by sensitivity analysis. For the main estimator or the analytical approach, there will be assumptions. Sensitivity analyses can test those assumptions in respect of a particular estimand. Other analyses which might usefully be provided to fully describe the trial data can be referred to as supplementary analysis. On slide 5, please, we start to think about what intercurrent events are. And I usually, in these introduction to Estimand type presentations, I make an apology for the new terminology and nomenclature. It's perhaps not an intuitive phrase, but those were all taken, and by adopting a word that was new to our lexicon, we were able to give it a definition ourselves. So intercurrent events is where we've settled. The figure depicts a few patients and what can happen to patients in the course of a clinical study. Now, if all patients were like patient number 2, in both treatment arms, describing the treatment effect that you wanted to estimate and actually making an estimate of that would be rather straightforward. Of course, in practice, life's more complicated. Patients will discontinue treatment, will take a rescue medication, they may discontinue the study, they may die. And if you sketch out a series of lines like this for patients who are receiving treatment, and another series of lines for patients who are receiving a control, and you sit down and you pose yourself the question, looking at this, what treatment effect do I actually want to estimate? Because we've moved a long way from a world where everyone is like patient 2. But of course this reflects reality. And is a useful way to, I think, to conceive of the importance of this conversation. On the next slide, slide 6, the definition of an intercurrent event that appears in the addendum is presented. So events that occur and either preclude observation of the variable or affect its interpretation. For example, use of another concomitant medication. Rescue medication is perhaps the one we've talked about the most, but in principle a change to the background standard of care or the use of a prohibited medication would also count. Adherence to treatment or failure to adhere to treatment, treatment switching, and terminal events, and that's depicted on the previous slide for patient number 5, such as death. That would preclude the observation of a variable in which you might be interested. And we want to differentiate these intercurrent events from missing data. Now, on the previous slide, I did have 2 patients, I think 3 and 7, who discontinued from the study, and of course that does present a missing data problem. However, in terms of intercurrent events, the interesting aspect for those patients is that they discontinue the treatment. The fact that I don't then go on to observe the outcome and the variable in which I've said I'm interested in does of course present a missing data problem. But these intercurrent events and their definition is to be distinguished from that conversation about missing data and when they actually observe what it is I said I wanted to observe. There's some more words on that in the addendum, of course. On the next slide, slide 7, having defined intercurrent events and gone through the process of thinking, well, in my trial, in the trial that's in front of me now, what are the intercurrent events about which I need to make decisions and specifications in order to clearly define the treatment effect of interest? We wrote down 5 strategies that could be applied, 5 different strategies, which if applied to a specific intercurrent event would result in a different treatment effect being quantified. And again, the aim today is not to go through in any detail at all, at least in abstract form, if you like, the definition and the meaning of these. It really is worth investing quite some time to think about each of these in detail. But we came up with 5. It may be in the consultation period that others are discussed, or that one of these categories is then subdivided and more strategies are described. But okay, the draft addendum starts with 5. And the addendum describes the possibility to choose a strategy for each type of intercurrent event. And if your Estimand addresses 2 intercurrent events, it may be that you choose different strategies to handle those. On slide 8, I very quickly wanted to rehearse the fact that this isn't just a document that exists at the ICH level. We've obviously been talking about Estimands for sufficiently long now that companies and indeed regulatory assessors, certainly in Europe, have started to use the word Estimand and the concept of an Estimand and the thinking that underpins the framework in discussions. And I've picked on experience from the scientific advice working party, where there's a gradually increasing number of procedures each month where this thinking comes into discussions. And I see already evidence of better conversations and some understanding of what it is that we're trying to estimate, and not only a discussion that's left between statisticians on how we should try and estimate something. And that's very gratifying. At the same time, we're working in an environment yet where strong fixed regulatory policies in terms of preferred strategies to deal with particular intercurrent events are not yet established. And that sounds risky even to some extent, but I'm really pleased it's happening, because without testing the framework and the different strategies in different scenarios, I think we would miss out on some interesting questions that have arisen. And by trying to do this in the day job, so to say, we'll get the most out of the public consultation phase and result in a better final guidance document. It says on the slide some interesting questions arise, and as you might have heard me talk about before, one of the motivations for starting this conversation was the increasing use of mixed models, MMRM, in studies with repeated measures, so longitudinal follow-up of patients and repeated measures, and questions being asked from the regulatory side as to whether that type of analytical approach really estimated a property in which we were interested. And it's been interesting that some companies have come forward and indicated that they genuinely are interested in following the ITT principle and the treatment policy strategy. And that's still supported with an MMRM as an analytical approach, with or without retrieved dropouts from patients who discontinue their treatment, and as well as then having a good conversation about what it is the company tries to estimate, you can have a better conversation about whether that method is fit for purpose. So that's what at least that's what I was planning to say by way of introduction, and to the extent that I've missed something important or that Frank would wish to supplement when Frank takes over the presentation, Frank, you should feel at liberty to do that, of course. We've got 3 examples on slide 9 to present to you. And as I say, these are not so much the run-of-the-mill example that illustrates the simple case. Hopefully most people have seen that before in one form or another. These are a little bit more challenging examples that I think better highlight the breadth and the potential of the framework. So if we go on to slide 10, and I'll present the first one before handing over to Frank. This is set up as a drug X that's intended for use in palliation in terminally ill cancer patients, and it is purely a symptomatic treatment designed, for example, to improve functioning and quality of life in the period immediately before death. So you might measure body weight or some aspect of the patient's ability to function within a relatively short period of time. 12 weeks is described on the slide. We're interested in quantifying the absolute effect of drug X, and we make a comparison to placebo. But it's inevitable that some patients will die during the follow-up period, and that needs to be addressed then as an intercurrent event. What treatment effect am I interested in respect of death? There is still anti-cancer therapy used as background. The patients are still receiving some anti-cancer medications in both of the treatment groups, but again, the drug of interest is not a priori expected to beneficially or detrimentally affect mortality. So on slide 11, we go through the ABCD, the 4 points that are mentioned in the addendum by way of constructing an estimand, which is a useful way of summarising the different attributes, or documenting the different attributes that go into making up an estimand, and not least because you can see very clearly how the different strategies to handle the intercurrent events play out in the ABCD. So we can define the population in which we're interested. We can set our variable to be the change from baseline in whichever of the attributes, the weight or the functioning, with a 12-week follow-up period. And we could, for example, look at difference in variable means as a summary measure. And if there's no intercurrent events, we don't need to specify anything about point C. But this is the sort of trivial starting point, and it's unrealistic in the end to expect no intercurrent events. And the one I want to focus on first is death. And in this population, specifically, it's unrealistic not to expect any deaths. So on the next slide, 12, let's rehearse the 5 strategies one by one and see how the estimand is affected by the choice of strategy. So if I think about the treatment policy strategy, that says I should look to the outcome variable at the defined time point regardless of the intercurrent event. And so I would need to work out the change from baseline in let's say, weight after 12 weeks, regardless of whether the patient is alive or dead. And that doesn't really make sense. One can't measure body weight or functioning after death. So the treatment policy doesn't fit well here. Slide 13, what we refer to as the composite, and this, if you like, is the most simple version of that composite strategy where we construct a composite endpoint. So the variable changes and becomes binary, having defined some criteria for success in terms of change in weight. A success or a responder would be a patient who's alive and with that particular maintenance of weight or functioning after the 12-week period, and I could look at the difference in response proportions. No need to specify something separate under C in respect to death as an intercurrent event because this is captured in the variable. So this is possible. This can be done and would quantify the difference in proportion of responders, but it's not really what you're clinically interested in. The patient who died at week 11, having maintained weight and function for that time, is a success in this palliation setting. Again, the aim is not to make patients live longer, but to make them more comfortable while they're alive. So whilst this strategy works in theory, it doesn't really get to the treatment of effect that's interesting in practice. So we go to slide 14 and think about the hypothetical and the change in the variable after 12 weeks if the patient had not died. Excuse me. Again, that's a question that you could pose, and a treatment effect that you could discuss. I think it's important to make a comment here, and this is in the draft addendum, that certainly while we're all learning how to use these strategies and how to define these strategies, I think it's important that these hypothetical scenarios are very clearly defined. So whilst I'm talking about death as an intercurrent event here, it would also be helpful to me if in specifying this hypothetical scenario, adherence to treatment was also specified. So are we assuming or are we constructing a scenario where the patient was alive and continued treatment, or where the patient was alive and discontinued treatment? Important to have the scenario fully described so that I can align then the analytical approach. Again, this is a clinical setting where we do expect patients to die, and looking at the treatment effect that would have happened had the patient not died isn't, at least to me, the most intuitive thing to do. So we'll move on to slide 15 and look at the principal stratum. And again, under point C, we don't need to write anything specific around handling the intercurrent event, because this is now defined through the definition of the population, where we can think about the subjects that are alive after 12 weeks. And here we have to give the usual caution that we are not talking about patients or subjects who can stay alive for 12 weeks on their assigned treatment. And this is not the sort of per protocol or observed case type approach. That's not what we're describing here. We're talking about the stratum of patients within the population who could stay alive for 12 weeks. So this is, again, something that we can write down, and we can understand the treatment effect that we might be estimating, but again seems completely out of sync or misaligned to what might be of clinical interest in this situation, where we want to try and make all patients comfortable for their remaining life, not just those who can live for a certain period of time. So we go on to 16, and the while on treatment strategy. This, I think, has been the most, possibly the most contentious of the strategies that we've discussed in the group, with perhaps its clinical interpretation not being always self-evident, and major concerns being raised around estimation if your estimand employs this strategy. Not least because if the follow-up times in the two trial groups are different, the interpretation of the estimate is complicated. Here, however, it seems to fit very well. While on treatment is actually read here as while alive. The intercurrent event is death rather than adherence, so this becomes while alive. And I have my population definition. I can construct a variable, which could be an area under the curve, or it could be a change from baseline until 12 weeks or death, for weight or functioning. And again, point C, the intercurrent event. I don't need to specify anything further. This is now handled through the variable, and I end up with the difference in variable means for change from baseline in weight while the patient is alive for the population of interest. And that really seems to describe the what in which I'm most interested. It really seems to describe the clinical question of interest. While the patient is alive, can I maintain their weight and functioning with this drug? There could be estimation problems, and there could be really severe estimation problems if the drug also affects survival times, although that's not a priori what it's thought to do. So this is included to illustrate a strategy which maybe in the end we will use less often and isn't so intuitively appealing, but really does seem to fit this case. If you want to go away and do a thought experiment, think also about some clinical safety type trials where you really want to know the treatment effect while the patient is receiving the treatment, not in the months or even longer after the patient discontinues. And then on slide 17, of course, again, it's not only death that would happen in this trial. We could also discuss around changes in background anti-cancer medication, which of course could also affect the reading of the outcome variable, or whether some patients used additional symptomatic medication, so that's more like the rescue medication type setting, and choose strategies to deal also with those intercurrent events. And in the end, construct an estimand which deals with all of the intercurrent events that are relevant to that particular population in that particular trial. So I will close there. Chrissy and Frank having spoken for slightly too long, as usual. Sorry for that. And I'll pass over to Frank for any complimentary or any complimentary comments around the introduction, and then for two further interesting examples, please, Frank.
Thank you, Rob. And I think you really did a very nice job in introducing the topic to us, as we assume that most of you who are listening in have already had the chance to look into this E9 document. I think we are leaving the questions for the end of this presentation. As Chrissy said, we will hopefully have about half an hour of Q&A in the end. And I would just like to build upon the presentation from Rob and present two more examples which will offer additional perspectives. The first example is for the treatment of chronic pain, and the main point of this example is to illustrate a little bit how you could indeed address multiple intercurrent events, so different types of intercurrent events in your Estimand description. So the slides I'm presenting are an abbreviated version of those that my colleague Francesca Caligari had presented a few weeks ago at the PSI one-day meeting and also at an EFPSI annual workshop. So some of you in this call may already have seen a longer version of this slide. As I said, it's about investigating a new drug for patients suffering from chronic pain, understanding that there are different etiologies in the chronic pain indication. And typically what's being done, at least in this study, is that pain is being measured on an 11-point numerical rating scale, NRS, for patient self-reporting of pain. So it is a scale that goes from 0 to 10, and I think 10 is the number for the worst pain. The scientific question of interest concerns a comparison in a randomized trial of comparing this new drug versus placebo, but understanding that some patients will face intercurrent events not leading to study treatment discontinuation, but possibly leading or having the potential of confounding effects. For example, some patients may have the need of changing the doses of the allowed concomitant medications for pain. And this could lead to some confounding effects that you would like to address. So this is one type of an intercurrent event. Other patients, however, may face intercurrent events leading to study treatment discontinuation, be it due to adverse event or due to lack of efficacy, due to the use of other concomitant medications, or perhaps due to other reasons. So each of these four categories actually does lead to its own type of intercurrent event, and you would like to understand in your Estimand description how you're going to address each of them. Finally, patients are allowed to take short-acting pain relief medication during the study. However, it was believed that this has no impact on confounding because this medications are mostly taken for episodes of acute pain, which are not really suitable for chronic pain, and this is why no confounding is expected. So based on this overall background, this already gives a good rationale for formulating the scientific question of interest, which then leads or guides the primary estimate pretty much along the framework that Rob had illustrated in his introductory slides and which is described in section 2 of the addendum, I believe. So here the scientific question of interest is to estimate the treatment effect of the new drug against placebo for the targeted population on the primary variable, where we want the treatment effect to be unconfounded by events which are deemed non-informative, such as the before-mentioned changes in dose of allowed concomitant medications for pain, but also accounting for the unfavorable outcome when a patient is unable to continue taking the study drug for different reasons, as outlined before, for adverse event, lack of efficacy, or use of other concomitant medications that would lead to study treatment discontinuation. So this is the scientific question of interest that serves as a basis for the more formal description of the estimand. And in terms of the ABCD framework, you could define the estimand as described here on this slide. So the population, for example, is given by the set of patients suffering from the chronic pain condition at the moderate to severe disease stage, and the patients may or may not already be on a concomitant medication for pain. Then you will have to define clearly your variable, which in this case is a change from baseline of your pain score, with some details about how you're actually measuring this pain score based on your numerical rating scale. Component C is the one where you're describing how you're going to address the intercurrent events to reflect your scientific question of interest, as events will happen post-randomization and which can be actually an expression of how well the treatment works. And finally, the summary measure, which in this particular case is the difference of variable means between drug and placebo. So this ABCD description on this slide is fairly complete. What is missing somehow is certainly the level of detail or granularity for this attribute C. So you would need to say a bit more specifically what is the treatment effect that you're interested in view of this several possible types of intercurrent events. So more specifically, here on slide 21, you see how these different types of intercurrent events could be handled in order to reflect your original scientific question of interest. So we are interested in the treatment effect if patients would not change the dose of allowed concomitant medications of pain. They are allowed to take short-acting pain relief medication, but they would continue to be treated for the entire study duration unless forced to discontinue treatment due to some of the reasons that I mentioned before. So you see how this example builds up from the general background of chronic pain over to the scientific question of interest, which guides the primary estimate description in terms of the ABCD components, where here on this slide I have details on this attribute C. And I guess what misses so far yet is it would be helpful for an informed discussion between different stakeholders also to provide justifications why you have, for example, selected those specific attributes. So, while this example is obviously confidential, so I can't give any too detailed information, but here you see at least some language towards the justification of the specific estimate, the primary estimate I had given on the previous slide. So more specifically, the desire to quantify the treatment effect of the study drug under the situation where any potential confounders are removed. The drug is taken for the stipulated duration. However, acknowledging the fact that we cannot ignore the situations where a patient can no longer tolerate or benefit from the treatment. So for whom a continuation of treatment would not be conceivable. Other patients who discontinued the drug due to other reasons could have theoretically continued to be treated without being put at undue risk. So to speak, the residual missing data, if you want to call it. So these are all, ways of trying to justify the individual components or the ways how you're going to address each of your intercurrent events. And you see, this is not a statistical aspect. This is truly a joint statistical and, more importantly, a clinical considerations how to justify the treatment effect that you're trying to estimate. So this is truly a drug development problem rather than a statistical problem in coming up with suitable ways of addressing your intercurrent events in order to reflect your scientific question of interest. Now, what still needs to be done, further considerations, and I'm not going to any details here because of lack of time, but you will have to say something about the statistical analysis, of course. So the primary analysis approach should be in line with the primary estimate, and this includes aspects of, for example, handling of changes in doses of allowed concomitant medication for pain, but also handling of missing data due to study treatment discontinuation. In addition to this main analysis or primary analysis, you may think about sensitivity analysis that could target the same estimate and is specified to assess the robustness of conclusions from your primary analysis. And finally, also in this example, we actually came up with several supplementary analyses for a broader understanding of the treatment effect, where these additional supplementary analyses would target different estimates, as opposed to the sensitivity analysis, which are really tailored to the assumptions made by the primary analysis. And the final set of considerations is about the trial design aspects and implications on the design. So, for example, you would need information on changes in dose of allowed concomitant medications. You need this information in order to do the sort of analysis you wish to do in order to address your estimate that you are interested in. But also you would like to retrieve dropouts and collect data after study discontinuation if available. So this is a real case study that we went through, and you see the individual steps that it needs in order to fully flesh out the details of your estimate thinking at different stages during your, at the protocol design stage. The last example that I have is, again, an abbreviated slide set from a presentation of my colleague Balder Magnussen, who will actually give this presentation, a longer version of it, on Thursday this week, if you're interested to learn more. And so that will be, I think that will be a PSI webinar at around the same time of the day on Thursday. And what is interesting about this example is that it uses this principal stratification estimate, which is one of the 5 estimate strategies laid out in the addendum and also briefly mentioned by Rob in his introductory slides. And this principal stratification estimate is probably the one which is least common to us, or we know least about it, at least within the pharmaceutical industry, we are not so well known about, we don't know so much about causal influence, and this principal stratification estimate may well need causal influence techniques. So this is an example that we recently came up with in a phase 3 context, where the target population was difficult to identify at baseline. And I will say a little bit more to this once I get to the visualization of our 3 main factors, which is the treatment T, the outcome Y, and some sporadic events E, which are then becoming the intercurrent events. So the treatment is an indicator variable taking values of 1 for the drug and 0 for placebo. The outcome Y is to assess the progression of the disease, and that is what we are ultimately interested in slowing down the progression of the disease. And then we have these intercurrent events. So these are sporadic events that reflect manifestation of the disease. And indeed, the further the patients progress in their particular disease, in this given disease, the less of these events, intercurrent events, we will actually see. So that those patients who are relatively more healthy, they would actually have a higher rate of these sporadic events, whereas the more sick patient, because they are disabled, physically disabled, they will actually see less of these manifestations. So this is an interesting aspect to keep in mind when defining the estimand. So you could visualize the relationship starting with your treatment T, which hopefully will have an effect on your outcome Y, and you would be interested in assessing this treatment effect. But then we know that some patients, more specifically the healthier patients, may experience a transient elevation of the sporadic events manifesting the disease. And we also understand that the occurrence of the sporadic events E can impact your disability or your disease progression, so to speak, your outcome Y. And we also understand that your treatment T is known to have a strong beneficial effect on your sporadic events E. So you see that we are actually not interested primarily in reducing the sporadic events with our treatment T, but primarily we are interested in understanding what is the effect of the treatment on the disease progression, especially for patients who have a smaller rate of these sporadic events, because these are the sicker patients. So this is the background, and this gives rise to the scientific question of interest, again guiding the primary estimand. And in this particular case, we would be interested in the risk ratio rather than the risk difference, but this is somewhat arbitrary for the purpose of this presentation. So we would be interested in the risk ratio of experiencing Y in the population of patients that would not suffer from these manifestations of the disease as reflected through the sporadic events E, and regardless which treatment they receive. So this is the scientific question of interest, which then immediately translates into the estimand we thought would be the appropriate estimand, so-called principal stratum estimand, which really focuses on the treatment of effect in the stratum, that is, the subgroup of patients who would not experience the event, the sporadic event, regardless of which treatment they would be assigned to, whether it's control or active. So we thought that this principal stratum estimand is of interest because if you remember the visualization, we really would like to understand the effect of T on Y. Now, before continuing with some of the further considerations around this principal stratum estimand, it is helpful to briefly revisit other alternative estimands, especially a number of estimands that could be implied by standard common analysis, and therefore we're going through a list of possible estimates that fall out and that kind of implied by standard analysis, and therefore like a retrofit from the estimation approach, common statistical approaches you would like to use, and what are the associated or the implied estimates. So some of these alternative estimates include certainly the treatment policy estimate, where you are ignoring the event that the sporadic events taking place, and this is almost opposite to, in some sense, opposite to the principal stratum estimate or the scientific question of interest, where we would particularly be interested in the direct impact of your treatment on your disease progression. So the treatment policy estimate is clearly addressing a very different scientific question of interest, and it was believed that this is not what was of interest. Now, you could look into the effect in the population of patients without this sporadic event prior to the study. However, this might not be particularly useful, especially if these pre-study events are not predictive for unstudy events, and certainly it also does not acknowledge the treatment effect on the sporadic events. So this was felt not to be a useful estimate. Also, you could look into the effect in the population of patients without on-study events. So what you're then actually doing is to condition on a post-randomization outcome which could be affected by treatment. And therefore, any estimate of the treatment effect of Y would then or might then not have a causal interpretation. And this is something we also preferred not to do in view of the potential selection and bias going on. Next, you could ask, what's the effect in a world where the sporadic events would not occur? So that would fall into your hypothetical estimate strategy. And it was felt that this hypothetical estimate is duly indeed hypothetical and maybe not of immediate clinical interest, because the fact that the events E are happening cannot be intervened on. So it's not totally clear how you would think about a situation where the patients are not manifesting a particular this particular disease in a given situation. So how would you deal with that? So overall, going through these various estimates, it was felt that these estimates are possibly not appropriate for our situation, but rather this principal stratum estimate is indeed what should be of clinical relevance. Now, I'm sensitive to the time, and we wanted to obviously to leave some time for discussion. And the next few slides would be somewhat more technical, slightly more technical, as I would lay out a bit, how do you phrase your estimate, your principal stratification estimate in mathematical terms, so then that you can from then on move on with your statistical models and your statistical inference. But because of the lack of time, I might be a little bit quick here, because this is not a lecture on causal inference, and the Belder might be able to present much more on Thursday anyway. But just to give you a high-level idea, we are introducing a potential outcome framework. So potential outcomes, meaning that we are looking into the potential outcome of each patient receiving a treatment or not. So E of T would be whether the patients would experience the event E under treatment 0 or 1, where 0 was placebo and 1 was active. So if E of T is 1, that means the patient would experience the sporadic event E under the treatment T, and E of T equal to 0 would mean the patients would not experience E under T. And likewise, you could define the potential outcomes for your Y variable, the outcome, so the patients who would experience Y if assigned to T, and in that case, Y of T would be 1 and Y of T would be 0 otherwise. So these E of T and Y of T are denoted as potential outcomes. So every patient would have a potential outcome under both active and placebo. However, in practice, in a randomized trial, then obviously every patient will only be assigned to one, at least in the parallel groups design, every patient will be assigned to only one treatment, and therefore you would have only one potential outcome observed per patient. Just the symbols E and Y would denote the observed outcomes. And why this is all interesting and relevant to us is because we can now formulate the estimate of interest. But in doing so, we would first acknowledge that patients could belong to one of exactly 4 strata or subgroups. So you see in the right-hand side the 2x2 table, so where in the 2 rows are denoted the outcomes, that is the events, if the patient was randomized to or was assigned to placebo, and then the patient could have no event or could have an event, the upper and the lower row. And likewise, we have the 2 columns, left and right, for the possibility of the sporadic events occurring, assuming that the patient was assigned to active. And again, you could have the situation of no such sporadic event and indeed such an event happening. And you see then we have the 4 cells, and these 4 cells are the 4 disjoint strata or subgroups, where, for example, the cell S00 would denote the stratum of patients who do not experience a sporadic event regardless of treatment. And the point being is that the stratum membership is not directly observable. What we can do is to observe the outcome on an actual treatment received. So, for example, a patient on active treatment, T equal to 1, and who would not experience an event, then this patient could fall either into the S00 or the S10 strata. But we don't know which of these 2, simply because we have not observed the potential outcome of that patient under placebo and what would have happened to the patient in terms of the sporadic events under placebo. However, this framework allows us now to clearly formulate our estimate in terms of this in terms of these potential outcomes. And if you remember, we are trying to ask the question, what is the effect of the treatment in the stratum or in the subgroup of patients who would not experience the sporadic events regardless of treatment assignment. This was the definition of the English definition, the verbal definition of the estimate we used a few slides ago, and now you can see that this is indeed the risk ratio of Y in this specific subgroup S00. And you can formalize it. I'm not going to details here, but this is how you can formalize it. And what you would have now to do is, after clearly describing this estimate, you would need to have certain additional constraints in order to identify this estimate. The identification means that we can write the estimates in terms of the probability distribution of the observables. I'm not going through this because of the lack of time, but you will have to, the slides, I guess, have been presented and have been shared, but there are additional steps that you can make, that you have to do. In particular, we are making a monotonicity assumption, which allows us to, based on this particular clinical context, to indicate that this particular stratum S01 simply does not exist. This is a substantive assumption that you won't be able to test with the data, but if your clinical rationale allows you to make this assumption, then you can proceed and actually identify the estimates or go ahead with identification of your estimates, and from that on you can, I'm just flipping through the slides, but from that on you can then move ahead with your particular inferences, either using a frequentist framework or a Bayesian framework. Either way are possible. Once you have been able to lay out these assumptions for the identification of your estimate, and under these realistic clinical assumptions. I appreciate that I was probably very fast now, but really these slides here are not meant to provide an exhaustive overview on principal stratification or causal inference, but this is more that we did realize during the course when we discussed the E9 document that this principal stratification estimate is probably the one that is newest to all of us, and therefore we wanted to take the opportunity today just to give, more to serve as a teaser on this principal stratification estimate. And, indeed it could be done in clinical practice if you do it carefully. And much more, as I said, will be said on Thursday in the PSI webinar, which I think will feature 3 different speakers on causal inference. And I think with that, let me conclude my part here and hand over to Rob and Chrissy. Rob, if you want to have additional remarks or maybe some concluding remarks, otherwise over to you, Chrissy.